If the ridge is rocky, doesn't have great soil, it's difficult to do agriculture there, it's difficult for things to grow there, why is it the most forested part of Delhi? If your goal was to build a forest somewhere in Delhi, or to imagine where a lush forest would grow somewhere in Delhi, I don't think you would choose the ridge. So why is it like that? And I think we only can answer that question when we start looking at history, especially these long histories of how agriculture and how pastoralism kind of coexisted or worked together. Ironically, that landscape, which in some sense you could say had been degraded by mining or has been destroyed by mining, has actually created all these new microhabitats. So in the monsoon, rain will fill up some of these pockets, and then you have various species of shrubs and trees that are growing in those little pockets. And if you go there now to the ARAVALI Biodiversity Park, it's absolutely beautiful. And you wouldn't know that maybe 30 years ago or 50 years ago there was massive mining. This was totally denuded. And just leaving, and within a few decades you see how the ecosystem regenerates itself. And not to say it's exactly the same as it would have been before the quarrying. It would be difficult to say that this is now a degraded landscape. Something has grown up, something has sprung up, partially through human intervention and partially just through, even letting it be in some sense is human intervention. It's a decision. It's not the fact just of making a decision to do something with the ridge, but what that decision is and how does it impact everything around it, and how do those impacts ripple out in various ways. But at the same time, I think the rhetoric of save the ridge, even if your intention when you're saying save the ridge, you might not mean okay, we need to demolish slums, but that rhetoric can then be taken up by other actors, by the government, by people who already have an interest in, for instance, beautifying Delhi in a particular way. That sense of beautifying meaning sort of getting rid of working class neighborhoods. So it's a tricky question. How do you develop an environmentalism? How do you say, yes, these things are important, trees are important, these landscapes are important, but how do you say that in a way that doesn't result in these outcomes that are basically anti-poor? Anyone who's spent time around the ridge knows that there's both poor encroachments and rich encroachments. So a lot of the farmhouses are actually illegal. Technically, according to the master plan, they shouldn't be there. They're in ridge areas. Right. What ends up happening is if you take a strong sort of anti-encroachment stand, as the city's sort of political economy works now, is that the rich encroachments will almost never get destroyed. In the present situation in Delhi, what that means, if you take that line, is that rich encroachments will somehow be allowed to stay somehow or other. People will figure it out. If people have that much money to buy that land and build a farmhouse, they'll have ways to manage those things. But the poor encroachments won't be able to do that. Sometimes they will. If they have political patronage, there are stories in the book as well of people who are able to fight and able to say, right, no, you can't destroy our land. But I think in some sense, then it becomes impossible to detach these environmental questions from other questions of housing. Why is it that there's such a massive shortage of housing for the working class, that they have to live in such areas, that they have to go into such areas? And the DDA, the Delhi Development Authority, since it's coming into being, has set targets where there should be this much sort of lower income housing, and it never meets its targets. These questions are very difficult to solve, but I think if you don't look at it at this level, if you just say, we can't have encroachments, and the way you enforce that is by demolishing slums, you're never going to get to the root of the problem. And we see also how this logic, how what seems like progressive environmental logic can be twisted and can be used by those in power in very kind of insidious ways. And so the people who started the Save the Ridge movement, obviously they wouldn't approve of that. Obviously that was not their intention. That's not how the sort of movement to save the ridge saw itself. But then this rhetoric gets appropriated, it gets twisted, it gets used in various ways. And I think then the big question, which people who care both about ecology and about social justice have been struggling with, is then how do you reclaim an environmentalism reclaim a sort of vision of ecology that sees humans and as part of the environment and says you can't have one without the other. You can't just build fences around the ridge and say you've solved the problem when you have this immense poverty and that's pushing people to encroach. So you have this community called the Odes. Basically this community that is very good at digging. Traditionally, this was part of their livelihood, digging wells, digging for agriculture, digging canals. And basically a lot of them came to Delhi when all of this quarrying was happening. So the Bhakti mines, they were quarrying there. And then when the mines shut down, their neighborhood, which was basically actively supported and promoted by politicians when they were needed to work in the quarry. After the quarry shut down, they said, okay, this is a slum, you have to get out. We're able actually to fight back because of political support, because of, protest, because of direct action. They were able to fight back. And so their settlement is still there. But basically what's very interesting now is they're asking to be recognized under the Forest Rights Act, which is actually a very unconventional use of the Forest Rights Act, because you think of it generally being used sort of deep in the jungle, like deep in, perhaps in central India, where there's like this very, dense sort of Adivasi areas. And they're saying that actually we are the people who have been living here the longest. And we have this tradition of working with the land. And basically they're saying, why don't you employ us, for instance, in the wildlife sanctuary? If your goal is to get rid of these Mexican mesquite trees and replace them with native trees, why don't you get us to know this work? Because we know the soil, we know how to dig, we know how to do these things. I mean, that effort is ongoing, and it depends, is the government receptive? I mean, this is the Forest Rights Act, in a sense, was not made exactly for this situation, but this shows this kind of innovation, this sort of use of progressive legislation, which is always a fight. It's not like you pass a law and then you've won. It's always a struggle. How is that law implemented? How is it seen? But I think this is an example where you see a group of people who are saying, we want to take care of the forest. We want to be part of these efforts. The forest department won't hire them because they see them as encroachers. These are people who are saying, look, we'll do this work. We need employment. The quarries are shut. And there's not, as of now, the political will to sort of make that happen. But if we could imagine that, that sort of interaction, then I think those are the sorts of projects. Those are the sort of environmental imaginaries. Those are the kinds of projects from below, from people who have experience working the land, people who have experience, using the forest, using the stones in very concrete ways. I think that is a sort of glimmer of hope in what is, I think, generally a kind of bleak picture of what's happening to the ridge and to Delhi from an environmental and other perspectives.